Welcome to a special edition of the CEC report. It's October 15th and I'm Robert Barwick. I'm joined again by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Well, thanks, Robbie.
All right. This is a special edition because first let me apologise, we haven't done one of these for a few weeks. The reason why is because both Craig and myself and others here have been tied up in a furious production schedule for this publication, our latest edition of the New Citizen, Defeat the British Crown's Green Fascist Dictatorship. This is a powerful weapon in the current political climate. I'm going to get Craig to talk about it, but before I do, I just wanted to sort of give a little bit of context to where we are at right now. This week, the carbon tax passed the House of Representatives against the wishes of something like 80% of the Australian people. There's an example of green fascism right there. So now the carbon tax is seen to be inevitable. Next week, the Queen of England and Prince Philip arrives in Australia for what might be their last royal tour to coincide with the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting over in Perth. Now, it's the Queen's demands on action on climate change that Julia Gillard has been following in ramming through this carbon tax, as we've been saying. Also, last week, Lyndon LaRouche dropped a bombshell. LaRouche emphasised that the unravelling global economic collapse has got to the point where the British and the City of London intend to pull off a Hitler-style coup in the United States. In other words, what LaRouche is saying is what we're dealing with is actual fascism. And I just wanted to emphasise those three things because when we use the word fascism and use the term green fascism, people have to take what we say very, very seriously. We are in a fascist period of history once again, and we'll dissect some of that now. But Craig, given this bit of context I provided, how would you, after having worked on it for so long, characterise this latest edition of the New Citizen?
Robbie, it's the most powerful weapon that we've ever produced as an organisation in our 20 years of history, because it goes to the core of the ideological debate which Julia Gillard has been part of as a Fabian, pushing this carbon tax, right? This is not to do with, there's no scientific basis for a carbon tax. It's not going to change 1 ounce of CO2 emissions whatsoever. This is an ideological battle between for the reduction of population on the face of the planet, pure and simple. Just like Hans Schellenhuber has said, he wants to reduce the number of people down below 1 billion. Prince Philip has said below 2 billion. This is an ideological debate, and that's why it's fascism. We don't use the fascism as a glib label, Robbie. There's no way in the world. But what we're talking about here is a series of policies that have been implemented specifically by an elite, by an oligarchy, of which, of course, the monarchy has been a prime mover in order to get rid of human beings, or more precisely, to get rid of the potential of human beings to develop ourselves on this planet. This goes back to what we refer to many times as the fight between Zeus and Prometheus, for example, where Prometheus wanted to give man fire. In other words, give man the ability of scientific and technological progress, but in many cases real fire like nuclear energy or what his time. But Zeus, representing the oligarchy or the elite, this band of very few so-called wannabe individual leaders, refused to allow mankind to have access to this sort of science and technology, scientific and technology.
For Zeus and the gods of Olympus, humanity were playthings.
Yes, and we have precise quotes in this paper, precise newspaper articles, where Prince Philip himself has come out and said we have to watch scientific and technological development in our...
Put the reins on it.
Yeah. I mean, what the sort of argument you'd expect coming from Zeus, you get from today's Zeus, which is Prince Philip. And the Queen is not by any means out of the picture in terms of some sort of docile player. Remember back in Chogham, she called for the nations of the Commonwealth to lead the way in the whole climate change discussions up in Copenhagen. Kevin Rudd, was the most vigorous supporter for climate change at that particular time, all the measures that were being proposed at that time. So what we've done with this paper is we've gone through and documented in detail the role of Prince Philip and the Queen, the monarchy, in promoting the fascist green dictatorship.
Yeah, because that's an important point. Anyone who's just listened to what you've said just then would be familiar with that as what the CEC says. We've been on record saying it for a long time. And of course, in everyday political communication, we don't always get to take the time to provide chapter and verse to back up what we say, even though we always could. So what we've done in this publication is we have put down in 52 pages the documented evidence of everything that we say about the royals, about the Green Movement, about this fascist takeover. And it's right there in black and white for everyone to see.
Yeah, it starts on page 35 and runs to page 52. I mean, it's a massive report.
The British Crown created green fascism.
Yes, right. And we go through how, for example, the second law of thermodynamics is a fraud. This idea that the universe is winding down. That
hang on, there's a bunch of heart attacks on the other end of that camera, Craig. I can feel them. They're in the future, obviously, but would you elaborate on that?
It's the idea that as processes continue, they lose energy. They become more random. They disperse, right? And the whole system winds down, and in the end, everything will just die a heat death, which is an absolute crock.
But it's a law. How can we call it a crock?
No, it's a law because it was made a law by the oligarchy that was controlling science at the time. It's not a law by any means. It's an arbitrary statistical heat law, which may be seen to work in the case of engines and closed systems, but it doesn't work at all in terms of the universe. Because in fact, if you look at the universe is anti-entropic. It means it's continually expanding. And one has to have a look at the number of species on the face of this planet from the time that the Earth came about into existence to today, and you just see this continual increase in the amount of energy in the system via the fact that you have increased diversity of plants, animals, and so forth. So you have actually the opposite taking place in the universe. But if we were to embrace that idea, right, it would mean the control structures of the oligarchy, of putting man in a box, a set of fixed rules, would be broken and shattered forever. And that's what the likes of Prince Philip and the others in the green fascist movement want us to believe, is they want to crowd us into a position where we don't have the ability to make the discoveries of the enormous number of physical principles that we still don't know in this universe that govern the processes that we
it's essential to the control mechanism of the oligarchy, in the sense that the oligarchy, the British Crown, for it to even exist in this 21st century, it's because they worked out the best way to control the people is to get the people to police themselves through the assumptions you put in their heads, so that when it comes to questions of nature and science, it's the oligarchy, it's the British free trade system that's destroyed world food production and made water unavailable because they've used green policies to stop us building water projects, etc. But we, the people, then think, oh, well, we're running out of food or running out of water because that's the universe according to the second law of thermodynamics.
When the opposite is completely true. I mean, people are brainwashed into believing that solar power is a solution or wind energy is a solution. It's a solution to the destruction of humanity, Robbie, because the issue is what we call energy flux density, the amount of energy per square metre of area. And when you take solar energy, it's very diffuse. You can't even build solar panels or build windmills from solar power. It's not possible. You can't build a windmill from wind power. You're still reliant on the higher forms of energy. And when you look at the progression of mankind, from the use of fire and then other in the form of just burning wood, to the development of using coal, to other fossil fuels, you see you're getting more and more energy flux dense forms of energy. Now, we moved into nuclear power in the post-war period of 1945-50. This is when the oligarchy, the green fascists, really started to move, particularly after the death of Roosevelt, which we go through in our paper. And you've seen a shutdown in the development of fire, as I was talking about in Promethean terms. So instead of having the development of real efficient nuclear processes, on a large scale, we've got them now, the technology exists, but they're not deployed on a large scale. The actual development of fusion-based reactions, and then into the future, matter-antimatter reactions. Instead of that becoming the norm for science, with science fully embracing the process of trying to discover the principles of how those work, we've got this insanity, this murderous policy of people saying, oh, we've got to rely on solar power because we're screwing up the universe, we're screwing up nature. In fact, by reliance on solar power and reliance on wind power, we're actually screwing up nature and the environment more.
Well, look, I want to go, we've touched on the second law of thermodynamics, and that's one of the definite bombshells.
I think we're going to have many shows on this, Robbie, because this paper is enormous.
Well, just to whet the appetite of the readers, and I want to go through, in brief, a number of these bombshells, just so people know what's in it. Before we go through them, though, just to make the point that if you, as a citizen of Australia, are concerned about green fascism and the green takeover, and even if it's just your concern is about the carbon tax, and you don't read this paper, you're willfully ignorant. Don't bother complaining. This paper contains what you need to know. So this is 52 pages. Don't complain it's too long. If you want to know, if you be an expert in something, master a subject. It's in there. It's taken hundreds of hours of thousands of hours of research and publication.
This is not for populists.
This is not for populists, no. So if you've got a longer attention span than Pauline Hanson, read this paper. Okay, that being said, can we just go through some of I've written a few of them down here. We've dealt with the second law of thermodynamics. One of the first bombshells that virtually everybody will come across and react to in this paper is the question of theology. Now, why is theology an issue?
Well, this paper also goes through our conference, Robbie. It goes through some of the key panels of our conference, which we had in July. And the problem with theology, it's been taken over by the oligarchy, such that what we get in terms of theological discussion today is based upon the premise that man is a beast. And the fact that is not true. Human beings are fundamentally different to the beast. We're not animals. In fact, we're created what we call imago vividae, in the living image of God, which means that we are created with the ability to make discoveries of the unseen principles of how the universe works. No other animal has that capacity, right? So we do that as human beings. It makes us godlike, in a sense, that we can participate, we can actually figure out how creation works. We are creative beings. The other part of that is that we can participate in creation. In other words, as human beings, because we can understand how the creation works, how the universe works, more and more, we can change the universe. Therefore, there's another term that we use called Capax Day. So when you talk about science and theology, they're actually one and the same thing.
Yeah, but you'd say true theology is scientifically based.
Yes, but most of our religion today has become nominalist, it's become empiricist.
And mystical.
So, it's not based upon science, whereas, the idea
they would say science and faith are different domains.
Well, they're actually the one. Just like art and science are actually the same domain, because it's got to do with the creative ability of mankind. And that's a ticklish issue these days, because we've had, centuries now of deliberate brainwashing. People like William Wilberforce, the so-called emancipator of the slaves. Who was he? He was in the employ of the British East India Company, the arm of the British Empire in, the opium trades, the slave trades, and so forth. There's so much fraud being perpetrated through history. We go through that in another paper, an earlier paper called "Defeat the British Empire of Monetarism." This is our history paper, which again, we're not a populist organisation, Robbie, so if people complain about our papers being a little bit hard to read, it's because people don't want to turn their brains on. And in this period of history, that's exactly what's required in order to defeat the fascism that we have.
And while we're having a dig at our good supporters who feel a bit hard done by having to read something, put themselves in the position of black slaves in the southern United States. They weren't allowed to read. And they weren't allowed to read because their slave owners knew that if they read, they'd be hard to control. So if you don't want to read, you don't have any excuses. Okay, can we touch on now, next bombshell, which I believe is the heart of this whole publication. We have a feature in here on Vernadsky, the science of Vladimir Vernadsky, which is from what you presented at our conference. Isn't the bombshell of Vernadsky the fact that Vernadsky is the most dramatic contradiction of the green philosophy that humans are the enemy of nature?
That's what the brainwashing of Darwinism has brought about, that somehow the natural selection process has happened as statistical random events. It somehow just happened. Well, what Vernadsky shows is that there's a lawfulness within the universe. In fact, in our own universe, we have the three intersecting domains that are governed by physical principles. We have the inert or non-living domain, we have the living domain, and then we have what he calls the noosphere. Now, each of these domains, whilst in a sense they're distinct, they're also part of a complete manifold governed by a manifold of physical principles. So what you find is that, unlike this statistical approach to evolution, you actually have a lawful process take place whereby the biosphere is evolving under the principle of life and actually creativity, both being physical principles. So what this means is that, Vernadsky caused major freakouts in the 1930s when he published his two books, the Biosphere and the Geochemistry.
Problems of biogeochemistry.
This was a signal actually to the British Empire at that point that we better do something about this. So you had guys like Arthur Tansley, for example, who's not talked about very much at all, create this fraud of ecosystems.
Yeah, in fact, the green movement that we know today that's taken over everything is actually a reaction to Vernadsky.
Right. And because Vernadsky was posing the actual true concept of how the universe works, and this was on the back of people like Alexander von Humboldt and the great actual naturalists and scientists of the period. And this meant that the universe was becoming intelligible. It could be understood. Vernadsky's noosphere was particularly powerful because he talked about this being the period of man coming into the period of man's creativity governing how the universe or the biosphere was going to be developed, right? And this is what he referred to as the noosphere. It wasn't originally, in a sense, there was other thinkers, people like, I can't remember the top of my head right now, but there's other people who developed this concept in part, but he really put it together.
With a degree of rigour that no one has matched ever since. And it's an amazing, we've talked about how the second law of thermodynamics is not a law, provably, which this paper goes through. What Vernadsky demonstrated is that human creativity governs the planet Earth as a law of nature. We are in a way that to try and separate us out and say, let's lock up, we'll talk about that in a minute, but let's lock up huge parts of nature away from the human impact, because human impact is by definition anti-nature, is the most scientifically ignorant thought someone could hold.
And that's what Vernadsky showed, and his entire work was, basically on how to develop the physical economy of Russia. And he was passionate as a Russian patriot to pull the Russian people out of the peasantry that they'd suffered under Tsardom into Russia becoming a great nation. And his, amongst the real scientists in Russia today, he's highly admired. Most people don't know about Vernadsky. They don't know about Vernadsky in Australia, so in a sense this paper launches who he is, and it's the major weapon against this green fascism, because as our young people keep finding when they go to these events around Melbourne, when they go there, the people presenting this green fascist ideas like sterilisation using lemon juice as a spermicide for Roger Short, this is an absolute complete quackery in terms of, there's no science in this. This is pure ignorance-based public opinion being promoted by the wealthy oligarchs and those that have an ideological agenda to promote population reduction. There's no science to it.
And if you want to summarise the ideological agenda, it's a vicious hatred of human beings.
Of the creativity within human beings. It's
because on that, you've touched on it before, but the the major feature of this publication is the British Crown created the Green Fascist movement, and we have in here the goods from go to woe of the whole thing, including the very important facts about how, when we in modern times, in the last few years, have been going after Prince Philip as the controller of the Green movement, we have the dossier in here of his hands-on, day-to-day direction and personal decision-making of calling into being, setting up and running the Australian Conservation Foundation in Australia, from which was spawned the entire green movement that's totally taken over today. That's all in there. What we also have in there is the history that preceded that, which shows the other point that we've always made, which is that the green movement was born out of the Nazi eugenics movement that gave us the genocide of Adolf Hitler and intends the genocide of the future world population. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, there's a lot to say, but in a nutshell, the World Wildlife Fund was founded specifically as a request from the International Union of the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, for the specific purposes of running this green fascist agenda. You had the formation of the World Wildlife Fund by the Nazi, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, open Nazi, Prince Philip and Julian Huxley. Now Huxley these guys are all, particularly Huxley, they're all part of the eugenics movement, the British eugenics movement, which basically says there's too many people and we've got to have specific races of people. Now it wasn't popular with after what Hitler did in Germany to talk about the issue of eugenics. So what happened was they rephrased this, changed the name into environmentalism, but it's the same idea. And you had people like Max Nicholson, who we go through in detail, who's regarded as the high priest of environmentalism, that actually was a Privy Councillor who promoted the promotion of these environmental ideas.
And the other thing that's shocking, even though we've gone after Gillard a lot, is it's the overlap between this crowd and the Fabian Society. And what's shocking about that is a lot of people would fall for the idea that the Fabians are some kind of movement that wants to promote the welfare of the working class. But the total partnership between the Fabian organisations in Britain and the aristocratic outfits that Prince Philip had all run, that's where this eugenics, racist green movement came from.
The initial birth of the Fabian Society was out of the great optimism that came out of the revolutions of Lincoln. And we have a whole section in here, the American system and scientific revolution of the late 19th and 20th centuries, which was actually the basis of our conference as well. So what you had was this enormous optimism based upon this principle of creativity coming out of the liberation at that stage of America against the British. That had to be stopped. So what you had is the formation deliberately by the British monarch at that time of the Fabian Society as a counterposition, a eugenics-based population reduction counterposition of that optimism. So you had the Fabian Society established by the Webbs and Beatrix Webbs and others at that time in order to destroy that optimism. That hasn't stopped. Now they merged themselves with the British Labour Party at that point. Right, so you had this idea of the working man. They had to have a broader sense, a broader base in which to operate, so they just merged. And gradually over the years, the Fabian Society has somehow become intimately linked into the Labour parties around the world. Now, interesting in Australia, they never got a foothold until old Labor basically died out after 1947. So the Fabian Society didn't get a foothold here in Australia whilst old Labor was around. But
the Labor Party that created like the Commonwealth Bank was not a Fabian Labour Party.
It was not a Labour Party of today, no. So you have this terrible, disgusting ideological bent within the Labour Party of Fabianism today and in Britain, which is responsible for these terrible policies that keep getting thrown up. And in the context of this, particularly in the post-war period, with the promotion of, at the highest level, the British monarchy is promoting environmentalism. Prince Philip founded the World Wildlife Fund. He personally came to Australia to help found the Australian Conservation Foundation. He personally campaigned in Tasmania, and we go through all of this. He personally tried to intervene to shut down the Lake Pedder developments, and there was big fights between the then Premier of Tasmania Eric Rees at that time, and Prince Philip. We've documented all of this. We've spent hundreds of hours in the archives. In fact, the ACF archives are still closed until 2015 because they don't want us to see what's in them. So the dirty secrets of what the Australian Conservation Foundation is about are going to come out, and they're going to come out for the public benefit of Australians, because if people are contributing to the ACF funding, then they better actually know what they're contributing to, rather than just being given this, sanitised view.
And also, the even greater relevance to today, everyone knows the carbon tax was passed because the Greens are in power. The modern Green Party is directly, Bob Brown's party came out of what Prince Philip did in Tasmania in the early 1970s. We should probably leave it there, Craig. Hopefully that's been enough to whet people's appetites. I'll also just point to the back. We have a series of maps in this publication, Australia in Lockdown, which gives you this incredible picture of how much of Australia is being targeted to be taken out of any human activity at all, brought off limits to the ability of us as a nation to develop ourselves.
I just want to say one last thing, Robbie. At the beginning of this year, on January the 15th, I launched a war against the British Empire. This paper is, I would consider, the next major assault against the British Empire as part of that war. This was not done lightly. This is a very, very serious publication. And it's not finished by any means yet, but it's very important that people that are watching this video don't just take what we say for granted, that they actually do some work here, because how much work they do is dependent on whether or not we can save our country from this encroaching green fascism, because ignorance is no excuse at this point of time.
All right. Next week we'll give a bit more detail on a very entertaining deployment or intervention that the youth members of the CEC pulled off yesterday against this character Roger Short that Craig referenced, who promotes the use of lemon as a spermicide as a contraceptive for women, and in his address to the Royal Society of Victoria, Roger Short talked about how in his 80 years the world population has increased by 5 billion people, which for some bizarre reason he started his speech by saying he found that personally humiliating. So that there is a very clear sign of the mentality of the people we're up against. And whatever it was, 100 Royal Society people attended this event to listen to this man waffle on an agenda that ultimately is about how we can get rid of most of those people. So we are not doing this in a vacuum. This is the issue of the day. Like I said, the Queen arrives next week, so we've got it out just in time. Call us for your copies if you haven't been called by us yet. Get them around, read them, and have a lot of fun in stirring up Australians to think about themselves differently, so that we stop accepting what's being done to our country on this. So thanks for tuning in to this week's special edition of the CEC report, and tune in again next week for more developments.